The dusty floorboards of the basement groaned as Megan pried open the hidden compartment in her late mother-in-law's vintage chest. Inside, 2 documents lay side by side, defying the laws of reality. A yellow death certificate for her husband, Caleb, dated 30 years ago, and a frantic newspaper clipping of a kidnapping featuring a boy with his unmistakable, deep-set eyes. The air in the cramped space turned frigid as Megan traced the ink, her professional training as a psychologist failing to quiet the scream building in her throat. A heavy, rhythmic thud echoed from the floor above, the unmistakable sound of Caleb's boots. He was home early from the fire station. Megan scrambled to hide the papers, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But the shadow of his large frame already loomed at the top of the stairs. As he called her name in that warm, heroic voice the whole town adored, Megan realized the man she had slept beside for a decade was a ghost built on a foundation of stolen lives. And he was already listening to the silence of her discovery. Megan Whitaker closed her leather-bound notebook, the pen scratching a final, precise line regarding a patient's progress. The office held the lingering scent of expensive perfume and freshly brewed jasmine tea, a fragrance that usually signaled the end of her professional day. She smoothed her pencil skirt, ensuring not a single wrinkle marred her appearance, and stepped out into the cool Illinois evening. The Naperville air felt crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Her SUV's tires crunched softly over the gravel driveway as she pulled into the suburban sanctuary she called home. Automatic lanterns flickered to life on the porch, bathing the manicured lawn in a warm, welcoming glow. Megan turned the key in the lock, the familiar click echoing in the quiet foyer. Immediately, the aroma of homemade pasta and basil enveloped her, a domestic lullaby that promised safety. Caleb Whitaker peeked out from the kitchen, wiping his large, capable hands on a dish towel. His smile, broad and genuine, acted as the most reliable anchor in Megan's world, grounding her after a day of navigating other people's traumas. The black fabric of Megan's dress still carried the cloying scent of cemetery dampness and the heavy, suffocating perfumes worn by mourning relatives. Down in the basement of the Whitaker home, the air remained stagnant and cold, smelling of dust and aging cardboard. Megan pushed aside heavy bins filled with tangled Christmas lights and tinsel, remnants of her late mother-in-law's meticulously organized life. Her fingers snagged on a rough, splintered corner beneath a metal shelving unit. She strained, pulling a heavy chest made of dark oak into the dim light. Intricate carvings on the lid were choked with gray grime, and the brass latch had long since succumbed to a crusty green patina. Megan ran her palm across the cold, unresponsive wood. An inexplicable heaviness settled in her chest, a physical weight that seemed to pull her shoulders toward the concrete floor. Megan fumbled with the jammed latch, her breath hitching as her fingers slipped against the frigid, unyielding metal. The heavy chest escaped her damp palms, striking the basement floor with a hollow, echoing thud. A dry crack of splintering wood tore through the silence of the subterranean room. Megan watched as the lacquered bottom of the box shifted, revealing a hollow compartment hidden beneath the velvet lining. A plume of fine, ancient dust billowed from the fracture, tickling her throat. She dropped to her knees, ignoring the sharp protest of her joints against the hard floor. Beneath the jagged shards of oak, the edges of yellowed papers appeared, tightly rolled and bound with a length of coarse twine. Megan's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that pulsed in her very fingertips as she reached for the hidden cash. Megan unpicked the stubborn knot of the twine, the old paper crumbling like dried leaves beneath her fingernails. She smoothed out a document bearing the stern, typographic letters and the embossed seal of the state. Her eyes raced across the lines, locking onto a name that made the world tilt. Caleb Whitaker. In the box labeled "Cause of Death," the words "acute heart failure" stared back at her with clinical indifference. Megan's gaze dropped to the date, which placed the event 30 years in the past. The age of the deceased was listed as 4 years old. A cold trail of sweat snaked down between her shoulder blades. She reread the name again and again, the ink blurring into a dark smear before her eyes. Her fingers spasmed, clutching the document so tightly that deep, permanent creases marred the fragile surface. Megan reached back into the cavity and pulled out the next item, a brittle newspaper clipping that threatened to disintegrate in her hands. The headline screamed about a child's abduction from a city park. Megan's eyes fixed on the name, Thomas Miller. A grainy black and white photograph showed a young boy in a striped t-shirt, flashing a gap-toothed, innocent smile. Megan pressed her palm against her mouth, choking back a sudden, violent surge of nausea. The basement air grew thick and syrupy, making every breath an effort. A high-pitched ringing rose in her ears, drowning out the steady hum of the heating boiler in the corner. She remained motionless, unable to tear her gaze from the date of Thomas Miller's disappearance. It felt as though the numbers were seared into the gray newsprint, and now, into her mind. Megan retreated upstairs, her movements mechanical as she retrieved a velvet-covered album of family photographs from the dresser. She laid the newspaper clipping on the bed, positioning it directly beside a photograph of a young Caleb Whitaker taken during his first year with the family. With the analytical eye of a clinician, Megan studied the shape of the earlobes and the placement of a tiny mole above the left eyebrow on both children. The resemblance was devastating, a photographic echo that defied coincidence. Megan felt the room begin to spin, the walls of her perfect life closing in. The gaze of Thomas Miller, frozen in that grainy past, seemed to pierce through her, demanding a recognition she wasn't ready to give. Megan slammed the album shut, the heavy thud echoing in the quiet room. But the image of those two identical faces remained burned into her retinas, stealing the very air from her lungs. A heavy mechanical roar rumbled outside, followed by the sharp, authoritative thud of a car door. Megan scrambled back toward the oak chest, feverishly stuffing the incriminating papers back into their hiding place. Caleb Whitaker entered the house, bringing with him the sharp scent of wood smoke and the bitter tang of cheap firehouse coffee. Megan kicked the broken shards of wood beneath the sofa, smoothing her hair just as she stood upright. Caleb hung his heavy turnout coat on the peg and took a step toward her, his presence filling the hallway. Megan hid her hands behind her back, trying to suppress the fine tremor vibrating through her fingers. Caleb's gray-blue eyes searched her face with a firefighter's sharpened intuition. Megan forced her facial muscles to cooperate, stretching her lips into a facsimile of her usual, affectionate smile. During dinner, Megan barely touched the food on her plate, her fork tracing aimless patterns through the cooling ragu. Caleb spoke about a clogged hydrant and a minor brush fire, his fork rhythmically tapping the edge of the fine porcelain plate. Megan tracked every movement of his jaw, every slight tilt of his head as he chewed. She searched for the ghost of that frightened boy from the newspaper page within the rugged features of the man across from her. Caleb reached for his water glass, and Megan's breath hitched. She noticed his pinky finger splay slightly outward as he gripped the glass, an idiosyncratic habit identical to the child in the old photo. Megan squeezed her linen napkin beneath the table until her knuckles ached. The man she had shared a bed with for over a decade was a stranger built on the bones of a dead boy. The flickering blue glow of the computer monitor illuminated Megan's strained features in the darkness of her home office. Her fingers hovered, trembling over the keyboard, as a digitized newspaper page from 30 years ago filled the screen. The headline detailed the ruin of the Miller farm and the subsequent tragedy that swallowed the family whole. Megan read the dry, clinical sentences describing the body of Martha Miller, found in a silent, empty nursery, and her husband, whose heart had simply stopped a month later on the steps of the foreclosing bank. Megan's eyes burned from the lack of blinking, a bitter lump forming in her throat. The Miller family had been reduced to ash and sorrow, while the boy who was supposed to be theirs grew up under a stolen name in the affluent comfort of Naperville. Megan flicked her eyes to the rearview mirror, and her heart skipped a beat. A grimy silver SUV with a jagged crack snaking across the windshield trailed 2 car lengths behind, mirroring every turn and lane change she made. When Megan veered into the parking lot of the local supermarket, the pursuer slowed, pulling to the curb without extinguishing its headlights. Megan gripped the leather steering wheel so hard the stitching pressed into her palms. A cold sweat soaked through her silk blouse, making the fabric cling to her skin. In the harsh, artificial glare of the parking lot, the unfamiliar vehicle looked like a predator lying in wait, its tinted glass concealing the face of a driver who watched her every move with silent, calculated intent. The warm, buttery scent of toasted bread filled the kitchen, but the smell only made Megan's stomach churn. Caleb suddenly reached across the table, his large hand covering Megan's smartphone where it sat beside her plate. He murmured something about an approaching storm, but his thumb moved with practiced ease across the screen, unlocking the device. Megan sat frozen, her coffee cup halfway to her lips, watching the rapid movement of Caleb's pupils as he scanned her list of outgoing calls. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock sounded like a hammer against an anvil in the sudden silence. Caleb slid the phone back toward her, his face a mask of domestic tranquility, though a single muscle in his jaw throbbed beneath his clean-shaven skin. Megan entered her office and immediately felt the shift in the room's energy. The cursor on her laptop was blinking in a document she hadn't opened, a few inches away from where she had left it. She pulled up her browser history, a sickening knot tightening in her gut. Caleb had scrutinized every link she had accessed in the last 24 hours. The Miller case archives, articles on black market adoptions, and forums dedicated to cold case abductions. Megan heard the floorboard in the hallway groan under Caleb's heavy, deliberate tread. The air in the small office felt thin, insufficient. She slowly lowered the lid of the laptop, trying to muffle the click of the latch, while Caleb's shadow flickered for a second beneath the door. A silent sentinel in the corridor. Megan pulled back the heavy velvet curtain in the living room and went still. The silver SUV sat idling directly across from the Whitaker mailbox. The driver's window slid down with a slow, mechanical whine, and Megan caught the glint of a long camera lens pointed directly at her front door. A sudden flash of sunlight off the glass blinded her for a heartbeat. The stranger, obscured by a dark baseball cap, took several photos of the house, methodically documenting the exterior of her life. Megan felt like a specimen pinned under a microscope. When the shutter clicked one last time, she retreated into the shadows of the room, pressing her shoulder blades against the cold drywall, desperate to escape the stranger's voyeuristic gaze. Megan stood in the dim garage, her breath coming in shallow hitches as she gripped a heavy pry bar. She jammed the metal tip into the seam of her father-in-law's old floor safe, but the steel wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the overhead fluorescent lights hummed to life, startling her. Caleb stood in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, his shadow stretching across the concrete floor. He didn't shout. He simply walked forward and pried the tool from Megan's numb fingers. Caleb leaned down, his mouth inches from her ear, his breath hot against her skin. He asked, in a voice that vibrated with a terrifying, low-frequency calm, exactly what she hoped to find inside. Megan saw her own terrified reflection mirrored in the wide, dark circles of his pupils. From the kitchen window, Megan watched Caleb stride across the lawn with the purposeful gait of a man heading into a fire. He approached the silver SUV, his shoulders bunching beneath the fabric of his shirt. The driver climbed out to meet him, but Caleb lunged forward, closing the distance until he was inches from the man's face. Megan saw Caleb's jaw working, his finger stabbing aggressively toward the house as he spoke. The stranger recoiled, his previous bravado dissolving under Caleb's sheer physical intensity. The SUV door slammed, and the vehicle sped away, spraying gravel across the pavement. Caleb watched it disappear with a heavy, brooding stare before turning slowly to look toward the window where Megan stood trembling. Caleb entered the house, shaking droplets of a sudden gray rain from his hair. He dropped a set of keys and a printed itinerary onto the kitchen table, his voice carrying a flat, metallic tone as he announced a trip to Gray Lake. Megan heard the underlying steel in his words, a command disguised as a suggestion. He spoke of unplugging, of a remote cabin deep in the woods where cellular service didn't exist. Megan looked at the map where a red dot marked a location surrounded by miles of dense, unforgiving forest. The sturdy walls of their Naperville home suddenly felt like a thin veil. Caleb began hauling heavy duffel bags from the closet, and Megan realized with a jolt of fear that this vacation was an extraction, a forced move into total isolation. Megan reached for her phone to call the clinic, her mind racing for an excuse to stay. But Caleb's hand clamped firmly around her wrist. He informed her, with a chillingly soft smile, that he had already taken care of her schedule. Her appointments were canceled, and her patients had been distributed among her partners. Megan felt the floor tilt beneath her. With a single phone call, Caleb had erased her professional identity and stripped away her only legitimate reason to remain in the city. She opened her mouth to protest, but he leaned in and kissed her temple, drowning out her words with talk of the healing power of the wilderness. Megan realized then that Caleb was systematically severing every cord that bound her to the world outside his control. While Caleb was occupied in the garage, Megan slipped her hand into the pocket of his heavy work jacket hanging in the mudroom. Her fingers closed around a crumpled piece of paper. She smoothed it out, her heart plummeting as she recognized the printout of an email she had sent to a private investigator only 3 hours prior. Her own words, detailing her suspicions about a 30-year-old kidnapping, were underlined in thick, aggressive black marker. The edges of the paper were mangled, as if Caleb had crushed it in a fit of silent rage. A wave of nausea hit her. He didn't just know about her curiosity. He was tracking her every attempt to reach out for help. She shoved the paper back, her hands shaking so violently she could barely find the pocket. Megan was folding a thick wool sweater into her suitcase when Caleb moved silently into the room behind her. His arms wound around her waist, pulling her back against the hard, unyielding planes of his chest. She felt the calloused roughness of his palms as his fingers dug into her sides like iron clamps. The embrace offered no comfort, no warmth. It felt like the closing of a trap. Caleb rested his chin on her shoulder, his proximity suffocating. Megan stared at their reflection in the vanity mirror, the image of a devoted husband holding his wife, while her heart hammered a frantic, trapped rhythm against her ribs. Megan leaned her weight against the cold marble rim of the sink, staring at her reflection through a haze of fine water droplets. The harsh vanity lights of the country club restroom accentuated the ghostly pallor of her skin and the frantic, glassy sheen in her eyes. The muffled roar of applause and the clinking of crystal from the banquet hall felt miles away, filtered through a thick layer of insulation. She clenched her fists until her short nails bit into the soft flesh of her palms. The silk of her gown felt like a restrictive binding, preventing her lungs from fully expanding. She pressed her damp palms to her temples, trying to stifle the rhythmic throbbing in her skull. She inhaled sharply, the air smelling of heavy bleach and artificial floral scents. A thunderous wave of applause crashed through the hall as Caleb stepped onto the dais. The gold medal in the mayor's hand caught the glare of the spotlights, sending a blinding flash toward Megan. Caleb squared his shoulders, his face radiating the stoic, noble resolve of a local hero. Megan shifted her gaze toward the back of the room and felt her blood turn to ice. Standing among the tuxedoed guests and bustling servers was a man in a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit. The stranger from the silver SUV wasn't clapping. He stood like a stone monument, his eyes narrowed into dark slits on a face etched with exhaustion. He shifted a heavy, tattered leather folder from one hand to the other, the edges frayed and darkened by years of handling. The stranger's eyes locked onto Megan's panicked gaze, and he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod toward the exit. His jaw remained set, the muscles twitching with suppressed emotion. Megan saw his fingers tighten around the leather ties of the folder, where the words "press release" were printed in bold, uncompromising type. A deep, hollow chill settled in her marrow. While the room cheered for Caleb's bravery, the world narrowed down to this one silent man and the secret he carried. He stepped forward, emerging from the shadow of a marble column, and Megan felt a phantom noose tighten around her throat. Every movement he made felt like the slow-motion beginning of a landslide that would bury her life. Megan scrutinized the stranger's features, and a grainy image from the archives flickered in her mind. The heavy brow, the distinct bridge of the nose, and the deep, permanent furrow between his eyes. This man was a weathered, broken mirror of the Miller farmer. She realized with a jolt of terror that this wasn't just a stalker. This was Thomas Miller's flesh and blood brother, a living ghost of the life Caleb had stolen. Her skin broke out in a cold, prickling sweat. Looking at his rough, calloused hands and scuffed shoes, Megan saw the chasm between the opulence of this gala and the poverty the real Millers had endured while Caleb thrived under a dead boy's name. Caleb vaulted off the stage, ignoring the sea of reaching hands and congratulatory pats from his fellow firefighters. His eyes found Megan instantly, and the mask of the triumphant hero vanished, replaced by a terrifying, predatory focus. He crossed the ballroom in 3 long, aggressive strides. His fingers clamped onto Megan's elbow with such force she had to bite back a cry of pain. Caleb leaned in close, his voice a dry, menacing whisper that sounded like dead leaves skittering over pavement. He steered her toward the side corridor, leading to the service entrance with a strength that brooked no resistance. Megan stumbled on her heels, the world blurring as Caleb practically dragged her toward the darkness of the parking lot. In the narrow, dimly lit service hallway that smelled of industrial floor wax, the brother of Thomas Miller stepped into their path. He raised the leather folder, his mouth opening to speak, but Caleb didn't even break his stride. With a brutal, practiced efficiency, Caleb drove his shoulder into the man's chest, slamming him against the concrete wall. Megan heard the sickening thud of the man's head, hitting the masonry. The brother slumped to the floor, his folder bursting open and spilling photocopies of old birth certificates across the linoleum. Megan looked back at the man's dazed, desperate eyes. But Caleb jerked her arm, forcing her forward. The heavy steel fire door swung open, and they were hit by a blast of cold night air and the rhythmic drumming of rain. The SUV's tires shrieked as Caleb took the corners of their suburban street with reckless speed, eventually swerving into their driveway. He shoved Megan toward the front door and fumbled with the keypad, his breathing heavy and ragged. Megan heard the rapid-fire beeps as Caleb punched in the bypass codes for the security system. With a series of heavy metallic thuds, the motorized security shutters descended over every window, sealing the house from the outside world. Megan stood in the sudden, oppressive gloom of the foyer, illuminated only by the rhythmic red pulse of the alarm panel. Caleb threw the heavy deadbolts, the mechanical clicks sounding like cell doors closing. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Caleb marched into the living room and slammed the shattered remnants of the oak chest onto the polished mahogany table. Megan watched as the hidden compartment gave way, spilling the twine and the yellowed documents across the surface. Caleb turned to her, his eyes appearing like black pits in the dim light. He admitted, in a voice devoid of tremor or regret, that he had known about the falsified dates and the stolen identity since he was 10 years old. He spoke of being brought to the Whitaker house in the back of a windowless van. The confession wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was a statement of fact from a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting a lie. Megan stared at the broken wood, realizing their entire marriage was a house built on a foundation of rot. Caleb took a predatory step toward Megan, his shadow looming large against the wall. He began to weave a narrative of the Miller farm, of drunken brawls, of neglect, and of the day his mother from Naperville found him with cigarette burns on his forearms. He reframed his kidnapping as a rescue, a benevolent extraction from a hopeless hell. Megan listened as he skillfully twisted the crime into an act of salvation, his voice becoming low and hypnotic. He touched the old burn scar on his arm, his eyes pleading for her to see him as a victim. Megan felt the invisible threads of his manipulation tightening around her, urging her to believe that the law was a small thing compared to the life they had built together. Caleb's fist slammed into the table, making the documents jump. He spat out the truth about the man in the hallway. The brother was demanding a ransom they couldn't possibly pay, and was threatening to go to the Chicago papers by dawn. Caleb paced the room like a caged animal, describing the immediate ruin of their reputations, the loss of their home, and the relentless bullying their children would face at school. He painted a vivid, terrifying picture of their future reduced to ash. Megan felt a paralyzing fear for Emily, and Jake take root in her chest. Caleb stopped inches from her, his hot, frantic breath ghosting over her skin as he demanded her loyalty in the coming storm. Caleb gripped Megan's shoulders, his fingers digging into her skin with a desperate, bruising intensity. He demanded she use her standing as a clinical psychologist and her connections at the medical board. She was to draft a formal evaluation of the Miller brother, characterizing him as a dangerously unstable individual suffering from paranoid delusions and an obsession with the Whitaker family. Caleb whispered that a few strategic calls to the local precinct from a respected doctor would ensure the police treated the man's claims as the ramblings of a lunatic. Megan recoiled at the cold-bloodedness of the plan. Caleb insisted this was the only way to safeguard their children's world, his eyes searching hers with the calculating stare of a man who would burn the world to stay warm. Megan looked into Caleb's eyes and realized the man she loved was a fiction. Before her stood a master of mimicry who had spent decades playing the role of the perfect husband. Every anniversary, every whispered, "I love you," and every shared joy was now tainted by the realization that it was all part of a sustained performance. She understood that if she agreed to his plan, she would be crossing a line from which there was no return. She would no longer be the woman who helped people heal. She would be the one who helped a predator hide. The silence in the room grew heavy with the weight of her impending choice. Megan gripped the telephone receiver so tightly, her knuckles turned a porcelain white against the dark wood of the kitchen island. Her voice shook with a perfectly calibrated tremor, the sound of a professional woman pushed to the brink by a madman. She described the man in the gray suit to Detective Hall, detailing how he had screamed obscenities and made vague, terrifying threats against her children in the middle of a crowded ballroom. She paused to let a convincing sob escape her throat, hearing the detective's pen scratch furiously against a notepad on the other end. Caleb stood in the shadow of the doorway, his arms crossed, nodding with cold approval as she used the phrases "socially unstable" and "erratic, threatening behavior." The heavy steel door of the floor safe in Caleb's office swung open with a muffled hiss of air. Caleb reached inside and pulled out several thick stacks of $100 bills, the crisp edges held together by blue bank bands. Megan took the money, the textured paper feeling rough against her fingertips, carrying the faint, metallic scent of ink. Caleb slid a handwritten note toward her, the contact information for a digital specialist who could scrub the cache of every state archive and search history in Illinois. Megan shoved the money into the deep pocket of her coat. The physical weight of the cash felt like lead, a heavy anchor dragging her down into a dark, murky depth from which she knew she would never resurface. In the back corner of a desolate, fluorescent-lit diner, Megan pushed a cup of lukewarm, untouched coffee toward the brother of Thomas Miller. She leaned in, her gaze locking onto his weary, bloodshot eyes, and began to speak in the low, rhythmic cadence she used for her most fragile patients. She reached out and touched his hand with a feigned gentleness, pointing out the inconsistencies in his story and suggesting that his documents were the product of displaced grief and false memory syndrome. She watched the light of hope die in the man's eyes, replaced by a clouded look of profound confusion. Megan felt the metallic, bitter taste of a lie well told coating her tongue as the man's shoulders slumped in defeat. Caleb knelt before the hearth, his face illuminated by the orange glow of the embers as he stirred them with a heavy iron poker. Megan stood behind him, a silent witness as he fed the original death certificate of the 4-year-old Caleb Whitaker into the flames. The paper curled and blackened instantly, the name vanishing into a swirl of orange sparks and gray ash. Megan felt the dry heat of the fire against her skin, the air smelling of scorched chemicals as the newspaper clippings of the Miller abduction followed. Caleb turned back to her, the firelight dancing in his eyes and erasing any lingering shadow of remorse. Megan stared at his empty, soot-stained palm, the physical evidence of a stolen life, now nothing more than smoke in the chimney. Megan fed a sheet of official clinic stationery into the printer and began to type, her mind automatically reaching for the most damaging clinical terminology. Her fingers didn't hesitate as she typed the diagnosis: delusional disorder, persecutory type. She signed the bottom with a flamboyant, authoritative stroke and pressed her professional seal into the paper, leaving a blue ink stain that would effectively bury the Miller brother in a psychiatric ward. The dry air of the office felt like sandpaper in her throat. She handed the folder to a waiting officer in the lobby, her face a perfect mask of weary, professional concern. She knew that these few pages were a final, bureaucratic execution of the man who had dared to speak the truth. The Sunday morning in Naperville was textbook perfect, filled with the melodic peal of church bells and the scent of expensive lattes. Caleb held Megan's elbow with practiced tenderness as they ascended the stone steps of St. James. Megan offered a graceful, practiced nod to their neighbors, adjusting the brim of her silk hat. Caleb shook the pastor's hand with a grip that radiated integrity and strength. Megan felt the envious, admiring gazes of the congregation, who saw only the golden couple of the suburbs. As she folded her hands in a mock gesture of prayer, she felt a hollow, icy cavern opening within her chest, a void that no hymn or stained glass light could ever hope to reach. Megan stood behind the gauzy veil of the bedroom curtain, her eyes fixed on the street below. The staccato pulses of red and blue police lights sliced through the twilight, reflecting off the pristine windows of the neighboring houses. She watched as 2 officers hauled the Miller brother from his SUV, his arms wrenched painfully behind his back. He didn't fight them. He simply stared at the Whitaker house with a look of silent, soul-crushing accusation. Megan jerked the cord, and the heavy velvet drapes swung shut, plunging the room into a manufactured darkness. She leaned her forehead against the cold glass, listening to the wail of the siren fade into the distance. The world was quiet again, and the truth was finally dead. Caleb approached Megan from behind, his hand steady as he fastened a heavy white gold necklace around her throat. The central sapphire felt like a shard of ice resting in the hollow of her neck. He whispered a low, fervent "thank you" against her skin, his lips brushing her nape before his hands came to rest firmly on her shoulders. Megan stared at their reflection in the mirror, the diamonds winking under the chandelier like the eyes of a cold predator. To her, the necklace felt like a gilded shackle, a permanent link to the man who had bought her soul. She touched the cold stone, her throat constricting as if the jewelry were tightening. Caleb smiled at their twin images, but Megan felt the weight of the gift suffocating her. Megan sat in her plush leather chair, facing a young couple who were desperately clinging to the wreckage of their marriage. She spoke to them about the sacred foundation of trust and how deception is a slow-acting poison that rots a family from the inside out. She watched as the husband and wife reached for each other's hands, moved by the profound honesty of her words. In that moment, a violent cramp seized Megan's stomach, and the acidic taste of bile rose in her throat. She took a slow, deliberate sip of water to drown the urge to scream. Every word of advice she gave felt like a jagged piece of glass she was forced to swallow. Yet she kept her professional smile perfectly in place. On the emerald green lawn, Caleb kicked a soccer ball to their young son, his movements a display of athletic grace and coiled power. Megan watched from the terrace as Caleb showed the boy how to subtly trip an opponent while maintaining a look of wide-eyed innocence for the referee. Caleb let out a booming, infectious laugh when the child successfully executed the foul, clapping the boy on the back in pride. Megan saw in Caleb's eyes the same predatory spark she had seen in the basement. He wasn't just playing. He was teaching their son the art of the beautiful lie. Megan gripped the railing until the wood dug into her palms, watching her children begin to mirror the man who had stolen a life to give them theirs. Megan walked into the bathroom and flicked on the high-intensity lights over the vanity. She leaned in close to the mirror, searching the lines of her face for any trace of the woman she used to be. The eyes reflected back at her were cold, guarded, and entirely unfamiliar. She realized she was no longer a healer. She was the curator of a museum of lies. The silence of the house felt like a physical weight, a permanent shroud over the life she had chosen to protect. She reached out and touched the cold glass of the mirror, her fingers trembling as she realized the woman in the reflection was the most successful lie of all.